her dreams, Juliane often sees herself on the streets of a city. Shops, display windows, bargains. Everything seems normal. And then all of a sudden the faces she encounters are broken. The heads are smashed, disfigured. But strangely enough, she is not afraid. Pucallpa, a god-forsaken place in the Peruvian jungle. Right next to the airport, a monument of plaster has been erected. A crashing plane is depicted all in plaster. And from there a dotted line follows the course of a river. An inscription explains that this was Juliane's route out of the jungle.
Alas de Esperanza, schwingende Hoffnung steht geschrieben.
Alas de Esperanza, Wings of Hope, is inscribed on this monument, which was erected in memory of those who died in the Lanza airline crash. I see this monument now for the first time in my life, and it touches me strangely, considering that I emerged as the sole embodiment of hope, whereas all the others remained without hope in this disaster. Here, on the side of the monument, a plaque has been mounted with a highly emotional inscription which reads, "Brethren, we are united here through our longing to reach the warmth of the sacred hearth of home. Christmas 1971, we were on our way thither, but instead we were cast into dark eternity."
Auf der Rückseite sind eine ganze Reihe von Gräbern angebracht in den traditionellen.
Back here, there is a row of graves in the form of traditional niches in which the dead lay buried. Quite a few names of very young people catch my eye. Some of them children, others barely 20 years old. Some of them are even represented by photographs. Here a young woman. Further on, a young man, barely 18 years old. All in all, over 60 of those stricken by the disaster lay buried here.
Siendo víspera de Navidad,
on Christmas Eve, all higher-ranking officers had left the garrison of Pucallpa and had returned to their families in Lima. Quite unexpectedly, I found myself burdened with the enormous responsibility of leading the search for the missing aircraft. It was a dramatic and heart-wrenching experience when we arrived at the site of the disaster. We found the widespread fragments of the wreckage, and there we saw trees hung with the belongings of the travelers. Suitcases had opened in mid-air, and the presents hung in the branches as if these were Christmas trees decorated for a sad holy night, as if they were adorned for the relatives of all those who never came home. A somber destiny, I think, had been preordained for this Christmas, and the tree stood as a funeral rite for those who had perished. Lima, Peru, The airport inaugurated only a few months before the disaster. The departure hall for domestic flights. Everyone knows the experience. Checking in at one of the counters, the most normal thing in the world. This is a film that lay dormant in me for many years because I myself had almost been part of this very catastrophe. Like anyone else, I was not out for adventure, war, or self-imposed dangers.
Juliane
Köpke, you have asked me to address you by your maiden name because of your expressed desire to maintain a certain amount of anonymity in your life at present. Under your maiden name, you have become world famous. You were 17 years old then. 27 years ago, we must have met here at these very counters. It was Christmas Eve day. Both of us were booked on the same plane. I was about to start shooting my film Aguirre, the Wrath of God. The story is about Spanish conquistadors in the jungle searching for El Dorado. Only later would I learn that we were fighting our way through the jungle, just a few rivers away from Juliane, as she, during these very same days, was fighting for her life.
I remember that we started the day with mixed feelings. On the one hand, we were glad we had managed to get this flight. On the other, we were worried and anxious because Lanza had such a bad reputation after 2 previous crashes. And yet, we were eager to return quickly to the jungle so we could celebrate Christmas at the ecological station my parents had founded deep in the rainforest of Peru. At the very least, we wanted to spend New Year's there with my father. But as I had just graduated from high school, I didn't want to miss the prom, which was planned for the 23rd of December, since this marked the end of a phase of my life.
All around here there was a crush of passengers. At some point I must have elbowed you aside. I managed somehow to put a $20 bill onto the counter, and the agent winked at me and she said, "You're on, you're all on." Then at 11 a.m. there was an abrupt announcement that my flight had been summarily cancelled. You see, after their crashes, Lanza had only one single plane left, which flew Lima, Cusco into the mountains and back. And then a second flight into the jungle followed. But the plane lay over in repair for an ominously long time. In the end, there was only time for one flight, and so only Julianes would take off on schedule. I remember the jubilation of that thick throng of passengers. We 92 are the lucky ones who will make it home for Christmas. You probably remember that.
Yes, everyone was overjoyed to be allowed to board and celebrate the holidays with their families.
There was only one question. Would Juliane be prepared to repeat all the stations of her odyssey with us? Do you dare? Do you really want this?
Well, what choice do I have after I have basically consented and come this far already? I think it is very important to have my husband along to give me moral support.
This time, however, we flew Aero Peru. Row 19, seat F, the window seat, the same as 27 years ago.
Nun, wenn ich ehrlich bin, ich fühle mich ziemlich nervös und angespannt.
Well, to be honest, I feel pretty nervous and tense. To sit in the same seat as 27 years ago, memories surge up, and they are not very pleasant. Since then, I have lost confidence in pilots and airplanes. I listen for every noise, and especially on a flight over mountains, because of the frequent turbulence.
At that time, the route also led across the Andes. On the eastern slopes begins the Amazon basin. Here, thunderstorms frequently gather.
Der Flug verlief zuerst die ersten 25 Minuten vollkommen ruhig und normal.
The first 25 minutes of the flight were calm and normal, nothing special. We got our lunch pack. And then it became increasingly cloudy. The plane flew into dark, dense thunderclouds. It didn't matter much to me. At the time, I still enjoyed flying, but my mother was somewhat anxious when she saw the storm front approaching. My mother sat next to me, and I was by the window, my mother in the middle, and in the aisle seat was an obese Peruvian man who fell asleep right after takeoff and was oblivious until we got tossed around pretty badly. We flew straight into the storm, and it was frightening how the clouds streaked by, as if they were living creatures. It was pitch black, punctuated by continuous flashes of lightning, and never before or since have I ever experienced such turbulence. Christmas presents fell from the overhead bins, and then suddenly I saw a blinding, incredibly white flash of light on the right wing, just as I am sitting here now. It looked as if lightning had struck one of the engines. I can't describe it precisely, but I had the sensation. At that moment, my mother screamed, "This is the end." And exactly what happened after that, I can't say. Later, fragments of memory returned. For example, that we were in a nosedive, and I still hear the deep roar of those engines. We went almost vertically down, and people screamed in horror. The souvenirs, flower bouquets, large parcels flew all over the cabin. And then, all of a sudden, I was outside the plane. I was suspended in midair, still in my seat. It was not so much that I had left the plane, but rather that the plane had left me. It simply was not there anymore. I was all alone with my row of seats. I sailed on through the air, and then I tumbled into a fall. I spiraled, face downwards. The seatbelt squeezed my stomach and I couldn't breathe anymore. And in this moment I realized with absolute clarity what had happened to me. But I had no time to be afraid, because apparently I lost consciousness. I can still see the jungle beneath me, a deep green, like broccoli.
Jungle as far as the eye can see. There are no clearings for hundreds of miles unless made by man. Here in this area, the fragments of the Lockheed Electra had rained down over an area of 15 square kilometers. The crash site is still vaguely known. Nevertheless, during pre-production for this film, it took us 3 unsuccessful expeditions to find it, with only the 4th reaching the place of the catastrophe. Sometimes it took us hours to advance a mere 300 feet. The march through the jungle was so difficult and the distance so vast that we decided to clear a small area just large enough for a helicopter to land. This time, Juliane landed softly. Brought all our provisions with us, including drinking water, as it was a dry season. Our camp was very provisional. The pieces of the aircraft lay strewn around us in the jungle. The casual way she dealt with the mosquitoes and other vermin was the first thing that struck us about Juliane.
Señora Juliana, tengo un monedero que me encontré con monedas antiguas en la parte del fuselaje del avión. Tienen monedas antiguas.
Hier ein Geldbeutel, der an der Absturzstelle
Here a coin purse found just outside the camp. It probably belonged to a little girl. I'm going to take a look inside. It contains 2 coins, old 10 soles coins, which are no longer in circulation.
Ich habe mir natürlich oft Gedanken darüber gemacht, wie es möglich sein konnte, dass ich aus 3 Kilometer Höhe so
Naturally, I have often pondered over how I could have survived a fall from 2 miles up and escaped relatively undamaged. There are 3 possible explanations. It is most likely a combination of the 3. Firstly, in very big thunderclouds, there are dramatic updrafts, which drive everything upwards, and these could have slowed down my fall. Secondly, the brief time that I was conscious in midair, I had the feeling that I was spiraling downwards and that the jungle seemed to be spinning beneath me. This might have happened because I was strapped to one end of the row of seats, which created an effect similar to a falling maple seat. At one end the seat and then a wing, the whole thing spiraling down.
Drittens wurde mir erzählt von einem der Männer, die bei der
Finally, I was told by one of the men who later reached the crash site that where my seat was found, tall trees were densely intertwined with vines.
bedeckt und durchzogen waren.
This maze might have broken my fall. It could be that I crashed into them and my seat spun around, and with the seat under me, I fell through this thicket and then, relatively softly, quote unquote, struck the ground.
In Anführungsstrichen auf den Boden aufgeschlagen bin.
Very close to our camp, Juliane searches the jungle with Juan, one of our native Indian macheteros.
Hier ist die Außenlackierung des Flugzeuges noch.
Here the paint on the outer shell is still visible, almost like new.
Sí, parece que es de adelante, ¿no?
Juliane came face to face with her own fate. This here had been the very plane in which she had flown. Her nightmare, a nightmare of each and every one of us, had become so concrete that it was finally palpable.
Hier liegt sogar noch ein Notausstieg.
Here, even an emergency exit with all the lettering.
And yet, Juliane seemed to be emotionally untouched by all of this. This shell, she later said, was a necessary protective device, part of a technique she developed to lead a somewhat normal life.
Hier gibt es noch Teile des Bodenteppichs.
Here there are pieces of carpet. The color is still there.
Alles inzwischen in die Erde gewachsen.
The strands have grown into the ground.
Man kann hier kaum gehen, so dicht.
You can barely walk here. The fragments are so densely strewn.
Hier noch eine Anzeigentafel.
Here is an instrument panel with a mesh of cables attached.
We have an image of how a sunken Spanish galleon is supposed to look. The carcass of the hull, bronze cannons, an open coffer filled with gold coins and pearls. But what a plane that has sunk into the jungle looks like has not taken shape in our imagination. We would probably walk right by. We would recognize it only if we paid close attention.
Das muss einmal ein Koffer gewesen sein.
This must once have been a suitcase, its metal frame. It's strange that the locks are still locked. Here the handle of a spoon. This is the heel of a lady's shoe. Here a hair curler, as was the fashion in those days.
Liliana, por favor.
One has found a piece of a tray. Shortly before the plane crashed, we were served a sandwich. Just before I awoke from my deep unconsciousness, I had two strange interwoven dreams. In one, I was flying around like crazy in a dark room. I kept dashing along the inside of the walls, and I heard a booming, roaring noise in my ears, as if I myself was equipped with an engine. In the other dream, I had the urgent need to wash myself, because I felt completely dirty. I had the feeling that my entire body was sticky and soaked with mud. I now really need to take a bath. And then I thought in my dream, well, it's so simple, you just get up and walk over to the bathtub. It's not far. And the very moment I resolved to do this, I woke up and found myself under the row of seats, completely drenched and covered with mud and earth. The rain must have poured down all night long. At this moment I realized that I had fallen from the sky to the ground. This is a row of 3 seats. Down here the bottoms and here a seat back.
No, así no, por el otro lado. Sí, así está bien. So ungefähr muss ich nach dem Absturz.
Roughly like this, I must have lain under the seats after the crash, the whole afternoon and the following night, until the next morning.
Als ich zu mir gekommen war, merkte ich ziemlich schnell, was
When I
eigentlich
came
passiert sein
to,
musste.
I realized pretty quickly what must have happened to me. I had crashed down in the middle of the jungle and the plane was gone. I tried to get up and could barely manage because my concussion must have been very severe. But I realized at this very moment that I was all alone. My mother had disappeared, even though I had come down with 3 seats. And the obese man who had fallen asleep on the aisle seat was also gone. And at this moment I felt completely helpless and God-forsaken, totally abandoned. At first I could hardly see at all. My left eye was swollen shut, and with the other I could only see through a narrow slit. I had lost my glasses. I had only 1 shoe, a sandal, and a thin, skimpy miniskirt, as was fashionable at the time.
Ich richtete mich auf, bis ich zum Knien kam und dann
I struggled to my knees, and then it got so black in front of my eyes that I had to lie down again. The concussion must have been very severe. After a while, I managed to sit up, and then I discovered the injuries I had suffered. My right clavicle was fractured and the pieces overlapped, but they didn't stick out through my skin. It didn't hurt at all. What astonished me was that here on my calf I had a long cut about this long and an inch deep.
4 Zentimeter lang und 2 Zentimeter tief etwa. Diese Wunde erstaunte mich sehr, denn sie
This wound really astonished me because it didn't bleed at all. It looked like a canyon, jagged at the edges, as if ripped by a piece of metal. It went deep and it didn't bleed at all.
Also ich spürte, dass überhaupt niemand mich war und ich dachte,
Well, I saw that nobody was around, and I thought, where is my mother? I must find my mother. As soon as I could get up somewhat, crawling on all fours, I started to search for her. I crawled around and I called out for her. My mother and I had always been very close. This is why it was inconceivable to me, and I can barely describe it in words, this feeling that when a person who so obviously forms an intimate part of your life is so abruptly, from one second to the next, snatched away from you. I think that anyone who has lost a loved one with such abruptness knows what I feel.
Juliane was happy with her parents. As a young biologist, her father desperately wanted to do research in the jungle. Shortly after the war, poor and without a passport, he dug himself into a cargo of salt on a freighter and reached South America as a stowaway. He then crossed the entire continent on foot until he reached Peru. This is where Juliane grew up. No doubt she must have inherited some of her father's dogged willpower. Juliane lived in a simple hut. From early on she took care of her own toucan and other animals that she loved. She attended the German high school in Lima, but only in the jungle did she feel really at home. She would soon move about like a native Indian. Juliane returns home. Her neighbor from the jungle station awaits her at Rio Pachitea.
Juliana, qué gusto.
His proud name is Carlos Aquiles Vázquez Modena, but everyone just calls him El Moro, the Moor.
Más adelante, ¿no? Qué bien, qué gusto de encontrarnos, Juliana, ¿no?
Después de tantos años.
Sí, para mí es un gusto, Juliana. Bienvenida a Panguana y a Yuyapich también, ¿no?
Me alegro mucho de estar aquí otra vez.
Gracias, Juliana.
The boat trip on the Pachitea is brief, then you reach the mouth of the small tributary Yuyapichis. Yuyapichis is a word in a native tongue meaning the river that lies, the river that just pretends to be the larger tributary Pichis further upstream. Everything seemed to be as always. All reminiscences returned to Juliane, and yet everything was different. It started with a newly constructed road through the jungle, the Amazon Marginal Highway. Hour after hour, there was nothing but deforestation, dead trees, and smoldering fires.
In those days, to get to our ecological station, you had to walk through the densest virgin rainforest. Nobody lived here. But now all this has been transformed into pasture land, all the way to the horizon and miles beyond. Only the area of our ecological station remains relatively untouched. It's back there where you see that tall tree with a fanning crown, a lupuna tree. Its wood is very valuable, and for years we have been trying to protect this area. In the area of this station, which encompasses just over a square mile, there are over 500 species of trees and at least as many other species of plants. So far, 400 species of ants have been found here, as well as over 350 species of birds, 52 species of bats, which I myself have studied here, and close to 80 other species of mammals. Roughly 50 species of frogs and at least the same number of reptiles. Of the insects, the butterflies are particularly well researched. There are 280 species of butterflies, not including the nocturnal ones, which must number much more than that.
Erich, Juliane's husband, is like her a biologist. He's an expert on wasps. Juliane has specialized in the habitat of bats. Here in the hollow of this giant tree, she observed bats for her doctoral thesis for more than a year.
I see there are still bats inside this tree, a small group. I can see them fluttering around. There is one hanging down. It looks in amazement at me that I have penetrated its habitat.
These are not bats, of course, but a species of cricket.
Cuidado.
Cuidado que me va a morder.
Conoces, ¿no?
Sí,
la
conozco.
especie, todo.
Esa es esa especie que vive en los árboles, ¿no? Que no es venenosa, no hace nada, pero que...
Ya estás libre otra vez, ¿sí?
The dangers of the jungle are basically misjudged. I'm standing here in Rio Yuyapichis, in the middle of the water, as you can see. There are stingrays, crocodiles, piranhas, and other fish that would love to have a bite of your leg. And yet nothing is happening to me. The piranhas are found here sparsely, and in moving water they are absolutely harmless. Here I have learned how important it is to find water if you are lost in the jungle. A small creek leads to a larger one, which eventually takes you to a river where you can find human habitation and help. When my parents were still here at the ecological station, an incident occurred which served as a precedent for me. An American team made an expedition into the Sierra Mountains, about 30 miles further upstream, and there an accident occurred. The leader of the expedition shot himself in the leg. He was a tall man, over 7 feet and quite heavy, so they sent a young student to get help. The young man soon became hopelessly lost in the jungle, but then did exactly the right thing. He luckily came upon a small spring and followed the water, and in this way reached Jujapichis, this river here, and 2 days later arrived wading through the water at our station, right at this spot where I am standing.
Back at the site of the crash, we almost overlooked the largest piece of the plain which had become engrafted in the landscape, here filling the frame from left to right. For the first time, Juliane appeared deeply affected by the sight of this. Only now did the catastrophe and her solitude acquire real dimension. The most extensive search in the history of Peruvian aviation turned up nothing. Even helicopters could detect no trace. The jungle had mysteriously swallowed the plane and its 92 passengers.
Ich sah nach oben in die Baumwipfel und bemerkte, dass nirgends.
When I looked up into the canopy of trees, I saw that there were no broken branches. The jungle was completely untouched. There was no sign of a path of impact. I was all alone with my row of seats. Not until 4 days later did I find another row of seats with 3 dead bodies. It was the only contact I ever had with anyone from this plane. It was a horrible experience. The seats were stuck in the ground. They were literally drilled 3 feet deep. They must have hit like a bullet. 3 women had been sitting there. They must have been killed instantly. They were driven into the soil head first. Only their feet stuck out. At first I was aghast when I saw this. I didn't know what to do, but I wanted to know if my mother was one of them, even though it should have been obvious to me that she couldn't be, as she had been sitting next to me. I approached the bodies slowly. I didn't dare. I took a branch because I didn't want to touch them, and I turned one of the feet over and saw that the toenails were painted. And it then became clear to me that this could not possibly be my mother, because she never painted her toenails. The only things I found at the crash site were a bag of candy, which I later took with me, and a Christmas cake about this size, as is typical here in Peru. It was completely soaked and full of mud. I tried to eat some, but it tasted so bad that I left it behind. That was obviously stupid. I should have taken it along, but at that moment I didn't realize I would be in the jungle so long. While I was searching there, all of a sudden a sound materialized. It penetrated my consciousness. It had been there the whole time, but somehow I hadn't noticed it. It seeped slowly into my consciousness. It became louder and louder and finally filled my entire head. It was the soft dripping, the trickling of water. I followed the sound and I discovered a tiny little spring where water ran over a stone and dripped into a small puddle. And this very moment I knew, with absolute clarity, that I had to follow this water to get out of this jungle. Anyone else would probably have stayed at the site of the crash and waited for help. But for me, it was clear that this was futile. And I followed this runnel because I knew that a small body of water flows into a larger one, and that I would eventually find help.
The course of water Juliane is following is without doubt the same one she followed then. Eventually, she reached this creek. Not having the slightest idea where she was, and uncertain whether she would ever make it out alive, she never had any moments of mortal fear. Her concussion was simply too severe to allow for any thoughts other than, advance, keep going, no matter what might lurk under the fetid surface of this water. Juliane, als ich mich vor einiger Zeit hier mit Juan und 5 Macheteros Juliane, when I hacked my way through here some time ago with 5 Macheteros, I discovered this. According to what you had told me, it was obvious that this must have been the propeller blade and engine you came across back then. However, you must have come from this direction, because the water flows this way.
Yes, that must have been the engine, which I found on the third day. Following the course of water, it was on the right-hand side. It was smeared all over with black oil and crushed like this.
Are you aware that after the crash in Cusco, the previous crash, it was discovered that the mechanics who maintained these engines had, up till then, only repaired motorcycles? And apparently the pilots hadn't any appropriate licenses. And the worst was that in Cusco 101 bodies were retrieved from the wreckage. There was one single survivor, the co-pilot, who had suffered severe burns. But the capacity of the plane was 92, which means that they jammed an additional 10 passengers on board.
Their reputation was really the worst imaginable.
Well, I only flew this line because it was the cheapest. I had to save money.
You were lucky that nothing happened to you. Their reputation couldn't have been worse.
Yes, I knew that. Juliane has her safeguards against the horror. She has frequent dreams about shelves, cases and racks, where millions of butterflies are stored away, all existing species of this world. It is, she says, as if I could safely lock away all the airplanes in the world so that they could not hurt me anymore. But then the dream turns into a nightmare. Suddenly there are no more living beings, no animals, only trophies. They are stored away in large halls, whole warehouses are filled with them, and the trophies are for sale. And then animal skins of every species, with only a few remaining frozen in poses from a distant past. They will never move again, they will never stir. They are caught in the abyss of time.
This is one of my saviors, so to speak. They are crested chickens, very primordial birds, with a peculiar and awkward behavior. They live in groups by larger rivers. They produce a snorting sound highly atypical of birds. When you approach them, they get extremely agitated. They keep flapping their wings and seem to bow to each other. It looks quite hysterical. The young ones live in slovenly built nests in branches overhanging the rivers. Quite often they fall into the water, but they have claws on their wings, like the primordial bird, the Archaeopteryx, and with great agility they climb back, up, through the branches into the nests. They are also good swimmers. They are pretty indestructible. This is one of my saviors. There are some crested chickens. You recognize them by their beautiful crests. It is a relatively large bird, which has a peculiar... Oh, that was just a woodpecker. For a moment I thought I had heard one. It's a large bird which has an atypical, but in the jungle very distinctive call. some sort of a wheezing snort or snarl. I don't remember it precisely, somewhat like this. Something like that. I can't really imitate it well. But 3 days after the crash, I suddenly heard these calls, and I thought, this is my salvation, because wherever those birds are, there must be a larger body of water. I immediately changed direction and headed straight for those calls, because I hoped I might find people. The mud is quite deep here. Exactly at this point I reached Rio Chebonia. You can recognize this spot by the amount of giant cane. There is no other place along this river where the Caña Brava grows so densely.
And Juliane immediately recognized that this river was not navigable, that she would not encounter people here.
Initially on Rio Chebonia, I saw and heard planes circling above me. After a few days, this ceased altogether, and I realized that the search had been called off. I was aware that I was now all on my own and that I could no longer expect any outside help. This is why my feeling of solitude and abandonment grew deeper.
All Juliane had was a single sandal and no tools of any kind. If she had only had a machete and a lighter, her survival would have been much easier. She could have built a simple shelter. She could have taken out the soft core, the heart of a certain type of palm, and eaten it.
¿Se puede comer? Sí, se puede comer. Se come.
She could have cut through a certain type of liana and found pure fresh water. She could have cooked the easily found chihuahuacu nut. You can also roast them in hot ashes. These nuts have a very high nutritional value.
I felt no hunger at all. During the entire time, I ate nothing. I felt no need to. However, I did drink a lot of water. The only thing that really alarmed me was this wound that I had on my arm. The flesh flies had laid their eggs there. Maggots had hatched, and they had eaten themselves deep into my flesh. They had bored a deep hole. When I turned my arm like this, I could look inside. They were half an inch long. The hole was this large, and I saw these maggots wiggling around. That's when I got frightened. I thought I might develop blood poisoning and eventually lose my arm. That really worried me. The wound is completely inflamed. 2 days ago, this horse was injured on a barbed wire fence. Now the wound is full of maggots, exactly the same kind of maggots I had up here in my arm.
Die meiste Zeit bin ich den Chebonia hinunter geschwommen,
Most of the time I swam down Rio Shebonia, waded or simply let myself drift. I saw crocodiles everywhere, mostly in groups of 2 or 3. Whenever I approached them, they would hurl themselves from the riverbanks, diving into the water straight at me, directly at me. Normally, anyone would flee in panic into the jungle, but I would have perished for certain there. I simply stayed in the water because I knew from the ecological station that crocodiles do not represent a danger. These caiman flee at the sight of man and always hide in the water. It was very strange, because I would get extremely close to the caiman and then, from either side, they would splash wildly into the water and dive right under me. In shallow water, I always carried a stick and poked the river bottom ahead of me because there are a lot of poisonous stingrays in the muddy shallows of the river. Stingrays are the really dangerous animals of the jungle, of these rivers, much more dangerous than the poisonous snakes, jaguars and tarantulas, which people generally fear.
The extraordinarily bad film about Juliane Köpke thus teems with crocodiles and other creatures eager to bite. The sensationalism of the alleged dangers of the jungle and an abysmally bad leading actress annoy Juliane.
Mami, hilf mir doch. Oh! Das Mädchen, das mich darstellt, stolpert.
The girl that plays my part stumbles through the jungle with the look of a hunted doe. And everywhere, behind each bush or tree, lurks some danger. She looks around and she sees a tarantula crossing her path. There, all of a sudden, a snake dangles from a tree and brushes her face. And she sees a jaguar that pounces from a bush and kills a mother monkey who happens to be nearby with her baby. The terrified young one leaps onto the girl's lap, and they cower together and find consolation in one another. Baby monkey stays with the girl during the night. Next day, the girl has to move on, but the little monkey doesn't want to leave its home, and they separate. And the girl cries out to the baby, "Don't leave me alone! Don't go!"
How did you spend your nights?
While it was still light, I searched for a place where I had some protection for my back, a small slope or thick tree trunk, and I collected some large leaves I could cover myself with. During rainless nights, the mosquitoes were particularly bad. They almost ate me alive, as I wore only a tiny and by now torn miniskirt. And when it rained, there were no mosquitoes, but the rain was ice cold, like stinging needles. And sometimes it rained all night long. When that happened, the leaves were no help, and I sat shivering and sleepless until morning.
Here below us, Rio Shebonia. It seems to consist only of meandering bends, and you can imagine how great a distance Juliane had to travel in vain. But for 10 days, she stuck to her route. Had she only known that Rio Zungaro lay in the opposite direction, she would have been saved within 2 or 3 days, as this river is navigable for boats all year round. Barely an hour passes without a raft or a boat going by. Along the riverbank, there are quite a few huts. But running off blindly in any given direction could have led Juliane to the deepest expanse of jungle. Juliane did the right thing, even though day after day she got closer to death.
As the days passed, my apathy grew deeper and deeper. Sometimes I let myself just drift in the river, and I had no thoughts anymore. I must have lapsed into some sort of trance. Then, On the 10th day, I settled down on a sandbank towards evening. I had by now grown very weak. I looked around. I didn't see anything in particular and half dozed off. But there was something that I should have seen, only I didn't see it in my semi-conscious state. Suddenly I must have come to, and I saw a boat right in front of me. I thought, this can't be real. Have I gone crazy? Is this a hallucination? I slowly approached it and touched the boat, and it was real. At this moment I became wide awake, looked around. Where are the owners? There was no one there. I discovered a small path at the riverbank, one I hadn't noticed before either. There were steps carved up there. The embankment was about 9 feet high. I tried to negotiate it, but I had grown so weak that even by crawling on all fours, I couldn't manage to overcome this little slope. It probably took hours, but I finally made it. And up there was a small thatched hut where an outboard engine lay wrapped in a plastic tarp. There I settled down and found shelter for the night.
Juliane and Moro are trying to catch a special species of frog, a so-called poison arrow frog. The native Indians used its poison for their arrows.
In this hut, I was completely apathetic. Although I felt no hunger, I knew I had to eat something, otherwise I would die within a very short time. All around me were this species of poison arrow frog, and I still wanted to eat them. My mind was in a fog. I tried everything to catch one of these animals. It was like mockery. One sat this close to my face, but I was already too weak. Normally, eating one wouldn't kill you, but in my weakened state it could have been fatal.
Puerto Inca, a village at Rio Pachitea. The man who is assisted by relatives up the embankment of the river is Marcio Rivera. He is a lumberman and he worked in the area of Rio Shibonia. He was the one who found Juliane. As he was well acquainted with the region, we sent him out before the shooting of the film to locate the crash site. He set out alone, and this almost cost him his life. This was a month ago. A poisonous stingray had stung him, and Marcio lay near death on a sandbank for 3 days. Then a boat happened to pass by, and as he had no money on him, they refused to take him along. He finally traded his shotgun for the fare. Juliane found the rifle and brought it back. She wanted to surprise her savior with it.
Don Marcio, what a joy to see you again.
Me gusta verle.
Sí. Aquí le estoy devolviendo su escopeta que había dejado en Shibonia. No podía salir en otra forma de ahí.
Marcio Rivera was one of 3 native Indian lumbermen who found Juliane. The other 2 have since died.
Sí, me ha pasado una cosa muy mala.
Something bad has happened to you.
Me cuenta, por favor, y me muestra qué le pasó ahí.
Me ha picado la raya, un pez, que es bastante conocido.
A stingray stung me. There are quite a few of them out there.
Casualmente yo tuve hace un mes, tuve una reverencia de usted que...
For a whole month I was very, very ill.
Al lugar.
Ay, sí. Qué profundo, ¿no?
How deep the puncture is. This must have really hurt a
Me ha
lot.
dolido mucho.
Sí.
Tal vez me puede mostrar en esa hoja
Esta.
cómo ha sido que la raya le ha
Esta es la
picado.
raya, ¿no? Usted conoce el pez de la...
Marcio demonstrates with a leaf how he stepped onto the ray.
Con las botas. Esta es el botas. Las botas estaban metidas en los pies, ¿no? ¿De verdad?
Naturally, he wore his rubber boots for protection.
No, ahí nomás sentado, no.
Entonces, cuando yo le pisé a la raya lanzó la espina, se puede decir, ¿no?
The ray struck with the sting-armored tip of its tail and hit Marcio's heel. It went straight through his boot. Marcio shows the hole.
Pasó la
Sí, pasó.
cola por...
Pasó la cola. Entonces, eso es lo que yo estoy diciéndole a usted también, ¿no? Muchas gracias, señora, que usted me ha venido a visitar de muchos años.
I thank you, Senora, for coming to pay me a visit after so many years.
It's been so long since I've seen you. I would be dead if you hadn't saved me then. I was very weak and lay half conscious in this hut. And suddenly I heard voices approaching from the jungle. At first I couldn't believe it. And then I had a feeling of boundless relief. He was the first person I saw, and it was as if an angel had come unto me.
The three men cleaned her wounds with gasoline and drove out some of the maggots. Then they took off in their boat. 11 hours later, they reached the Pachitea in the first village. As a result of her fall, Juliane's eyes were still so bloodshot that people whom she met en route fled in panic because they thought that they had seen a forest demon. From a small airstrip, she was flown out to Pucallpa to a missionary hospital. Months later, released from hospital, Juliane is in an airplane again. As in a tunnel view, forwards and backwards in time, she sees herself, left behind in the jungle at the site of the crash. All around her, there is no one, only the voices of the forest. Further and further she moves away from herself, and further than thoughts can reach, an ocean of jungle extends around her. She wants to continue her search. She wants to find all the fragments of the plane and lift them from the ground and resurrect them. She wants to reassemble the whole thing. But it dawns on her that nothing can be reversed, that nothing can be annulled. Did she sit behind one of these windows? Was she perhaps hurled into the void through this exit? Juliane sees herself again during her flight into the void. Alone, strapped to her seat, she sails on further and further. Around her there is nothing but a yawning abyss. She flies on for weeks. Then it becomes dark. As it becomes bright again, she sees a way out, a door of deliverance. She walks through the door, and all of a sudden she beholds an angel engulfed in light. All fear departs from her. All screaming falls silent. She does not breathe anymore. Overwhelmed by bliss, her heart stands still for an entire minute. And she knows that a boat will come, slowly and softly, to carry her away, to rescue her at last.